I think we are getting started now. Good afternoon. My name is Dennis Misigoy, Libertarian, running for the U.S. Senate here in the state of Florida. Just coming back for the weekly live stream. I'll keep it probably a little bit shorter today. Running a little late, but you know it is what it is. But I always want to make sure I try to make time to talk to you guys as much directly as I can. I always got these little things that pop up when you get the stream started, man. That's the problem with not using something more than what's built into some of these platforms for getting this out, which for me is just Facebook and YouTube. If you ever want to look for these again, you can find them in either one of those places. If you're following me through anything else, you got routed to here through anything else. But let's see, man. Trying to think what is stuff to talk about in particular. I guess two things I had on my mind actually were a little bit sort of outside of my normal purview, which are more relevant to us here in the state. Not really relevant to the office of U.S. Senate per se, but just a couple of topics in particular the last couple of days that I think have just been making the news here around in the state. One of them is this sort of ongoing fight with the Republican establishment, particularly Governor DeSantis in the state, and Disney. As some folks know, after the I forget the actual correct name of the bill, and I really don't like using names like when people say, the Don't Say Gay bill. That's the bill I'm referring to, but it doesn't actually say that in the bill, and so I don't like using those kind of names. But the proper name of the legislation escapes me. But after that was passed, amongst many other sort of entities, Disney, which is obviously a very big employer and a very just big economic force here in the state, had some comments and was kind of taking a little bit of a stand against it after the fact, because of a lot of outrage from at least some of their employees. I know it's not monolithic. I think that's a what's it called? Not a misjudgment, just a bad assumption made by at least some observers who are talking about this sort of subject and trying to analyze it and make some sense out of it and what the consequences of it are going to be. But this thing has really devolved into sort of a ridiculous and I think just absolutely stupid kind of a pissing contest, basically. Excuse my language, but we've got the state government, in particular. I think it was the Senate, the Florida State Senate, which went ahead and passed some legislation to try to end or get rid of the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which is the oh lordy, what's popping up over here? Yeah, I thought I was typing and I wasn't. Anyway, the Reedy Creek Improvement District which is basically this sort of zone in which Disney operates, which traverses across both Orange and Osceola County. All this land, and this has existed since the 1960s. This was part of the deal that Walt Disney originally got to get everything set up, which basically allowed them to kind of both have the freedom and responsibility to do a lot of things like setting up their own infrastructure, both in terms of roads, plumbing, electricity, and things like this, which at the time certainly Orange and Osceola County were not at all prepared to meet, but which also gave Disney quite a bit of autonomy in terms of being able to set up and create, build up what they wanted to have there, and really again have the freedom, which continues to this day, to build unencumbered by a lot of the red tape that impacts much more mundane sort of projects, things that are a lot less interesting and certainly a lot less unique and would require a lot less study than the sort of things that Disney builds. They've enjoyed this for a while, and now the governor began threatening that they should maybe pull the plug on this, and the Senate has actually taken the steps to sort of do this. There's a couple of interesting observations. I have a couple of observations about this. One of them is that it's just so stupid. Disney has been good for Florida, and Florida has been good for Disney. Both sides of this relationship have benefited tremendously from them being here. And I think a lot of the ways that that's happened is really self-evident. This is the issue that has sort of sparked all this really has nothing to do with that. It is this sort of culture war, utter nonsense, which again is just another side effect of the involvement of government in all these aspects of our lives. It's just another opportunity for a battleground, for a battle that doesn't need to be fought. If we were in, and again, it is sort of pushing a little bit of, I don't want to say utopianism, but certainly an ideal of not having the government involved in every aspect of our lives, and in particular in this case, it was driven by a law regarding education, in particular public education. Now, if we didn't have schools that were actually being run by the government, and I could give you a proposal for public education if we wanted to not have, to at least have education available for everyone, even if we weren't going to run government schools. And this is the problem, because we have government-run schools, and when we have government-run schools, it means you have government deciding from the top down what's going to be taught in the schools, and setting all the rules and everywhere. And in reality, what would be much more ideal, as any libertarian, and I think any advocate for small government and decentralization should really recognize, is that schools, just like any other, education, just like any other service or good, would be better delivered through a market, where there's competition, and where there's not, again, this singular top-down approach and making decisions for everybody. People within our communities, Florida is amazingly diverse, and we have a lot of different views, but because of that, that also means we have diverse sets of values. Some people who want their kids to learn one way, some people who want their kids to learn another way. And it's very important for them to have that option. Again, not that whoever is stuck in one kind of school or another, or to be stuck in a particular kind of schooling and basically be condemned to going through this particular system. And in this case now, because again, we have a top-down decision, rather than schools, and let's say even school systems independently, if schools as individual units want to organize into sort of a de facto district, I wouldn't anticipate it would be something similar to what we have today, where you have the counties and elected superintendents and school boards and whatnot. I wouldn't anticipate it to be something like that. I would expect something a little different, a little more free-flowing. But who knows? I mean, we won't really know for certain until we actually give it a shot and allow different solutions to be tried. But the schools can determine what it is they're going to teach. The parents pick the school that best aligns with their values, instead of what we've got here with the governor shouting a decree down, even if you think he's right on the issue, and you think the restrictions that they're putting are perfectly reasonable. The whole problem here is that we have at hand is that it's the governor putting it all on down. And again, that's not to say that the other side is necessarily taking it from the same principled perspective that I'm talking about. Again, they'd be happy with the top-down solution as long as it agreed with them. But again, that's not the point, and that's not what we seek out. We want freedom for everybody to be able to, have their kids learn in a way that's consistent with their own values. If you were doing that, or if we were doing that, there wouldn't be all these grounds for culture wars. And I think I really always want to stress this when we talk about the whole issues in public schools. This isn't something new. It's always been a battleground. Maybe not always, but certainly very often. Okay, the recent stuff with teaching stuff about gender in particular, sort of this gender. I'm trying to think what's a good way to frame the content that's actually at issue here. But this sort of gender instruction or anything sexual related to kids in these really younger grades, that sort of stuff that has been recently talked about, gone and on with critical race theory. This is just the latest iteration. A generation before, or not even, you have the issues on sex education, whether you have comprehensive sex education or abstinence only. Whether you have, if you want to go back a couple more generations, you have discussions about whether you want to have evolution taught in schools or creationism or some of these other things. So there's always been an ongoing thing about what do you teach in public schools and who gets to decide it. And unfortunately, that ends up being some kind of governmental body dictating, because it's a government-run school. It's inevitable. Rather than allowing parents to send their kids to a school that's teaches content that's consistent with their values, the values they want to raise their kids with. And it's one of the reasons why so many people are turning in more recent years, especially with what's gone in the last couple of years, to homeschooling, which again allows them to really have a lot more hands-on control. It does come with, obviously, needing to have a much greater involvement, and it's not easy. But it's one of these ways where you get away from this sort of thing. But getting back to it, man, it's so insane that on this issue about content in a classroom, which doesn't really affect the relationship between Disney and the state at all, they're willing to shoot both of them in the foot, basically, by creating this conflict. And if the state goes ahead, I've heard different estimates about, massive amounts of debt that's going to end up, if this were to actually, if the Reedy Creek Improvement District were to be dissolved, debt that would be transferred over to the county governments in Osceola and Orange counties, just a myriad of issues, and again, certainly would probably also, somewhat to the delight, or at least I guess it's part of the intent of the governor on this case, is to try to make it more difficult for them, basically, so that they have to now deal with the local governments who are, I guess he views, a little more consistent with their sort of values. And but that's going to inhibit their ability to continue to do what they've done, to be as successful a business, because they won't be able to just move in the same ways. I think that's almost a given. And so who wins out of that? Nobody really wins. I guess maybe the governor scores some points politically, and in giving it a second thought afterwards, I think maybe that this is actually something that really sort of crystallizes part of the problem with politics in the mainstream right now, is that the governor could take this, if they manage to do this, the governor could take this as a big win and try to show it off and say, look, I did this and taught these guys a lesson and put them in their place and whatever. But the state's not going to benefit from it. The people in the surrounding areas are not going to benefit from it. Certainly Disney's not going to benefit from it, but that's the intent. But, there's sort of the thing, what is it, the cut off your nose to spite your face or whatever. We'd be inflicting self-harm on ourselves as a state. But it's important to remember that it's inflicting harm on the state. It's not going to be inflicting harm on DeSantis. He's not going to be paying the cost. Just as is always the thing with people in government. They'll make these decisions and kind of do something like this. And it really is, somebody else is going to pay the cost. So if they're not... if they all really are willing to go through this and to move this along and actually make this happen, it's it's just, I guess, another example of that, of where they're willing to take action for real superficial sort of reasons like this, and no matter the cost and no matter what the harm it's going to do to other folks. I think there's a couple other interesting observations about it. One that really isn't my observation. I got to admit, I got it from somebody else. But one I thought in particular is that think about how fast this thing moved to the U.S. Senate. Through the Florida Senate. How recently did this whole issue and this whole row began? And yet the Florida Senate has already voted on this and passed something to try to dissolve the Reedy Creek Improvement District. Now compare that to what you hear from Florida Republicans about constitutional carry. It's a real night and day difference because, the governor will get up and try to present himself as he would sign a constitutional carry bill if it got to his desk. But where's the motivation from the GOP? And this isn't even to give the governor a pass. I'm pretty sure that if he wanted to push this through, he clearly wanted to send a message to Disney, and he clearly wants to kind of flex his muscles, as it were, in that interaction. And so they were perfectly motivated and went along with it and just got up into it, and they passed that in the Florida Senate. But where's that sort of motivation in constitutional carry? It's a night and day difference. For that one, there's a million excuses, and it's just never coming through in the legislative session. But this kind of shows you how differently it is when the Florida's Republicans are motivated. They can get something like that as soon as the issue comes up. But when it comes to stuff that the rank and file Florida voters, Florida Republicans, conservatives, who care about things like constitutional carry, that's on the back burner, man. We don't have time for that. We're gonna get after Disney, but we don't have time for constitutional carry. I think that's an interesting observation. Like I said, it wasn't mine originally, but I thought that was a real intriguing thing to kind of look at with it, because it really does show where these guys' priorities are, and it is not with doing these things that actual conservative voters in the state care about. So, yeah. Let me look at some of these comments. So, yes. This little bit in here, which was we just talked about with the Second Amendment. Yeah, the Second Amendment is not a priority for these guys. The Democrats are supposed to be against big corporations like Disney. Look, man, everybody's against this, that, or the other thing until that thing is on their side. They love big corporations. They won't say that, but they will love them when they're on their side, and they praise the fact when they are supporting whatever kind of social movements. Other guys make a lot of observations about this. And you see it sort of talked about, particularly in the current context. Particularly if you've been paying attention to politics over the last decade and a half, and you remember sort of like the Occupy Wall Street, and when all these people were really out there after these big companies, and now what do you see from all these big companies, particularly like the Wall Street, big financial firms and stuff? They've got all these equality and diversity initiatives and these things which really sort of pander to these cultural elements on the Democrat side, and now they're just part of the team because it obscures the stuff that they had issues about. One last thing I had in here, and here it is. I guess I missed the comment from Joe over here because my screen was a little bit shaken off. It was in a little bit different place here. So, but yeah, to remove the self-governance due to what these guys said, it is also an example of government or people within government just saying, well, these guys are my enemies and they're saying something, so I'm going to remove something from them. But it's also interesting for me in particular as a libertarian, because as libertarians, obviously, we reject the idea that you need government to do this, that, and the other thing. And actually, Disney's sort of an interesting example, whether you like big corporations or not. You did have, or you do have still, largely privately run infrastructure there. This was kind of what was set up to allow them to self-govern. And I don't have a problem with them self-governing. I just think all of us should be self-governing. It's like the sort of joke when you hear some libertarians will say, when they say that, half of all Americans aren't paying taxes, and they say, great, we're halfway there. we just got to get the other 50% to not be paying taxes now. But yeah, having a region of the state that again is largely, all of this is largely done privately, really does show a good example that this doesn't lead to chaos. This isn't, something that is, or it's not something that inevitably leads to somebody. Again, I can't tell somebody what will happen in absolutely every possible case or what's the likelihood of this or that, but certainly it gives us an example to say, well, you don't actually need government to do this, that, or the other thing. In this case, because you had a private entity that was willing, given the autonomy, given the freedom, to spend a bunch of their own money to build something, and they have I should say, a natural incentive to create good infrastructure, to create a functioning infrastructure, clean, nice environment, largely do a lot of the things that we sort of take for granted that have to be done, and in particularly when it comes to public spaces and everything else. Obviously, it's a little bit different within there, but the point still being, it shows that this is inevitably chaos. It shows that it can be done, and it really sort of weirds me out to think that, well, anyone would cheer on getting rid of that if you're an advocate for liberty and you want to demonstrate the fact that government is not the answer in these sort of things. You could have some giant mega corporation buy up a bunch of land and develop it to do whatever sort of things they wanted, and some might be very exploitative and just destroy the sort of land. But again, there's only so much incentive to do that sort of thing versus to build up something of decent quality that actually serves a purpose and provides a real benefit. To that bit also about the giant big corporations, it reminds me of another thing as well with that I often hear with particularly on the Republican side of hating celebrities, and we don't want to hear what celebrities think, but I always get a chuckle out of it because I say that it's basically they don't care what celebrities think until they find celebrities that agree with them. I mean, and hell, look who was their last president. So, I mean, it almost epitomizes that. So, but really, any sort of low-level celebrity they can find that will agree with them, they will elevate to the next level. Ours passed highest budget ever. I believe so. I mean, to be fair, the state has almost. I think the state has had Republican majorities in the legislature my entire life. I could be wrong, but I'm fairly certain of that in Florida. It's not shocking. Speaking of the state legislature as well, I believe there's a little bit of a conflict going on about the redistricting or the redrawing of district lines for the state legislature going on at the moment, which is interesting. And it brings to mind, in particular, I believe part of the issue is at hand is that certain districts which were predominantly black, and so the seats were, again, sort of expected to be, and it's something interesting that goes on with politics and how these districts are drawn up. Some of them that are very interestingly drawn up to try to elicit specific results, and in particular, some of that has been along racial lines, if we're perfectly honest, to get a certain kind of representation in the legislature. Now, I believe there's a bit of conflict over the fact that what's being proposed and what's they're trying to pass in terms of those new lines would break up some of these districts and leave it with some of these communities divided up into different districts where they would not form a majority within any of them, and they would essentially be stamped out as a voting block to have real representation in the state legislature. To which I want to say this also. I think it's extremely antiquated sort of thinking that guides us down this path. The idea that political representation needs to be tied to geography, that I need to be represented in Congress or the state legislature by the same person who represents my next door neighbor. There's this antiquated way of thinking of politics and what their responsibility is, and to say that where you almost think about it like, well, I'm just gonna. It's sort of the classic kind of pork barrel spending. I'm gonna go to Washington to get stuff for my district and bring it home and to do that sort of thing. But that's not what it's supposed to be, is it? Isn't it supposed to be, where it's about democracy and applying principles and representative government, where the people who go to debate these things and to sponsor and vote on legislation are supposed to be representing us and our views. But the reality is that particular how our population has grown, and I think just the way modern technology and communications has changed the world, we really are all over the place, and our values are not tied to our values are completely, maybe not completely, but are largely detached from our geography. Certainly there are rural areas and places that are maybe a little less densely populated where there might be a little more homogeneity. Maybe I'm speaking more out of turn from being someone who comes from one of the more major metropolitan areas and lives in another one now, born and raised in Miami, and then now up here in Central Florida for a little while. But we are diverse, and our political values are diverse, and there's no reason why, again, if we had 100,000, 200,000 people who wanted to be represented by a libertarian, there's no reason why that shouldn't be at least one seat out of Florida's 20 some odd seats in the U.S. House. But instead, they have to be in one district, and that's part of the problem that we have here. And what it leads to is that all these people are disenfranchised across the state because they don't live in the same district. But this idea, and it really shouldn't be that crazy when you think about it again. And this is true across any of these kind of areas in the state, but the fact is, why do we still believe that political representation needs to be tied to geography? I think it's very antiquated. It's very it's just inconsistent with the reality of modern political thought and population distribution and everything that goes into it. So, and it certainly has not resulted in a government that is representative of the people. Every year, or I shouldn't say every year, but every election cycle, we see where a libertarian or some other third parties may get some small percentage of the national vote, national popular vote, I say. So if we say that there's 3% of Americans who want to have somebody other than a Republican or Democrat, well, where are those 3% represented among the several hundred legislators? It's only because we're not in the same place. And this leads to stuff like the Free State Project, but not all of us want to move to New Hampshire or some other such place. I think there'd be better places to do it, honestly, if I were going to try to do that. But anyway, but I think it's another one of these things where you have this conflict right now over where you're going to draw the lines in a new district mapped for the coming decade, and it's a problem that wouldn't even need to exist. Just like the conflict I was discussing over public schools curriculum doesn't need to exist. These problems don't need to exist. We could get around these problems. We could get around the problem in education by not having government-run education. And we don't have legislators and governors deciding what's taught in schools. You have schools decide what's taught in schools, and the parents decide whether they want to send their kids there. And obviously then the parents can have input as well through their decision-making and through just normal communications. Likewise, this conflict over districting is a conflict that doesn't need to happen. It's a conflict that is solved instantly by just eliminating districts and figuring out, based on vote totals per representatives, who gets a seat, or maybe so many people vote for one person that person gets 2 votes in the legislature. I don't know. But if we can get away from this idea that representation needs to be determined by a map, by geographical proximity to one thing or the other, you solve this problem. And groups that want to have their representation, as long as those groups exist within the state, they'll have it because they'll have enough votes, and they'll have at least a seat at the table. And that's what we want, at least as a starting point, a seat at the table to be a part of the discussion, and help making the decisions at a bare minimum. A seat at the table to have our voice heard. I think that's a simple, basic enough request, and so I'm going to leave it there because I'm looking for a seat at the table myself. My name is Dennis Misigoy, again, running for the U.S. Senate here in Florida. The URL is up on the screen. Go check it out if you haven't. What else can I say, man? I will talk to you guys again next week. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you then.